In this lecture, we will see how to use argument in the function. Let's modify this code to say hello by using your name. For example, here I entered my name and I want this function to be modified in order to display hello Alper on the screen. To do that, I have to use some argument for this function as seen in this definition. And please note, if you need to enter more than one argument, you have to separate the arguments with comma operator. I put the argument here. After that, I need to modify this part in order to add this argument into the message. Let's leave a space here to make the message look better and use addition operator. So, this part is modified. If we try to call this function without using any argument as seen in this line, we will get error message because we are not using any argument to call this function. Let's see this error message on the screen. Let's see what happens if we enter this variable as argument in this function call. Finally, the message, which is hello Alper, is displayed on the screen. Please repeat this example by entering your name also in order to see the result. This is the end of the lecture. In the next lecture, we will cover the functions with default arguments. In this lecture, we will cover how to define a function with default argument value. In the example from the previous lecture, we got error message when we call the function without entering any argument in the function call. If we define the function with default argument value, we wouldn't get any error message. As you can see from this sample function definition, we need to assign initial value to the argument. So let's do that here. Let's say dear customer. Here, dear customer is the initial value of this argument in this function definition. Let's call this function again without using any argument in the function call. Since we didn't enter any argument in the function call, the output displayed on the screen is hello dear customer. Let's call this function by using this variable as argument in this function call. Since we use this variable as argument in the function call, the message displayed on the screen is here. It is shown how to define function in Python. We will not implement everything in one example as shown in this definition. We will cover step by step in order to make it easier to understand. Since this definition could be a bit complicated for you in the beginning, let me introduce this simplified definition instead of this one. In Python, function block starts with this keyword. After def, we have to enter the function name. After the function name, we have to put opening and closing parentheses. If it is needed to use arguments within the function, then we have to enter arguments. But if not, it is not mandatory to use arguments in the definition of the function. After the closing parenthesis, we have to put colon operator. After the colon operator, enter the statement or statements which are going to be executed when this function is called. Let's start with a very simple example. Assume that you need to implement a function which displays a message on the screen when it is called. Let's say this message is hello, so this function doesn't need any argument to be entered. When we define this function, we don't need to put any referential name for any argument at all. Let's start implementing this function here. First, we have to write def. Next, we have to enter the function name. Let's say hello is the function name. Next, put parentheses. After the parentheses, put colon operator here. Let's continue with the next line, and please note this indentation here. Here, we can use print function, which will display the message on the screen. Finally, the definition of the function is done. Now we need to call that function similar to how we called print function without argument. Enter the name of the function which we just defined here and put opening and closing parentheses. With this code part, we are calling this function. Since we are working in the same file, we don't need to use any reference, so we can directly use the name of the function here. Let's save and run this code in order to see the result. When we call the function, this message is displayed on the screen. In this lecture, we will cover how to implement a function which returns a value. In order to do that, we will use return keyword. Assume that we need to implement a function which returns the summation of two arguments. Here is the sample for that task. By using def keyword, we started implementing this function and we named this function as some parameters. There are two arguments which will be used within the function. These parameters are arg1 and arg2. You can use different names. And here we put colon operator. In the following line, we assign the summation of these two arguments to the variable named result. At the end of this function definition, we return the result by using return keyword. The definition of this function is done. Before we call this function here, we created two variables, number1 and number2. Number1 is equal to 3 and number2 is equal to 5. And here we called this function, we call some parameters using number1 and number2 as arguments. Here, by using assignment operator, the summation of number1 and number2 is assigned to the variable named summation, because when we call this function by using number1 and number2 as arguments, the result for the summation of these two arguments will be returned by this function. At the end, we will display the result of this summation. The summation of these two variables is returned by the function successfully, and we assigned this returning value to the variable named summation. The value for summation is successfully displayed on the screen. We already used Python functions. Also, we already know how to call or use function and how to enter arguments into the function. In the previous examples, we used print function very often, and we entered argument between the parentheses of print function to be displayed on the screen. We also covered how to enter a variable as argument to a function in Python. We also covered how to use or assign the returning value of function to a variable. In Python, we can also define new functions. Let's quickly cover it in the following lectures. We will cover how to access the members. Let's continue with the same example. Let's create another object here as well, and let's call that new object as car2. For car2, let's say make is C, model is D, and year is 2000. In order to access the members by using object name, we have to first enter the object name, and it is followed by dot and member name. Let's call the method named display parameters for these two objects. Object name dot member name. If the member is a method, we have to put opening and closing parentheses. Let's do the same thing for car2. Let's save and run this code to see the result. Let's cover what happened step by step. First, an instance object of the class is created, which is for car1, and this message is displayed on the screen. Related to what we are covering, this method is called by saying car1.displayParameters. So the parameters for car1 are displayed on the screen. And here, an instance object of the class is created for car2. Next, this method is called for car2. So the parameters for car2 are displayed on the screen. Let's access another member which is not method. Let's say we would like to display this member on the screen. Let's use print function. So we have to first enter the object name dot member name. Let's do the same thing for another object. As displayed on the screen, we could access this member for both objects by using this formula. We have to first enter object name dot member name. We will cover class variables in Python. Class variable is shared by all the instances of the class, and class variable is defined outside of the methods of the class. For this example, let's say we need to count the number of cars. Let's name this variable as total number. We first entered it within the class and outside of the methods of this class, and let's say its initial value is 0. I need to increase this number within the initialization method, because whenever an instance of this class is created, it will be increased by 1. Let's modify this part. Whenever an instance of this class is created, this number will be increased by 1, and total number of car will be displayed on the screen. When the first instance of the class is created, this number is increased by 1. When the second instance of this class is created, this number is increased by 1, and this message is displayed on the screen. Let's do one more thing here. Instead of displaying the total number of cars for each creation of instance, let's display it at the end. Let's save and run this code to see the result. We are displaying the total number of cars by accessing this class variable. Let's create 4 instances for this example. When we created 4 instances of this class, the total number of the car is displayed as 4 on the screen. In this lecture, we will cover how to create a class. In order to create a class, class keyword is used. After that, class name is entered. Let's say class name is car. Next, we have to put colon operator. And we can go to the next line. And please note the indentation. And please remember that indentation and colon operator are very important in Python. As we did while covering the functions, we can optionally enter documentation string. Next, the constructor can be entered. Constructor is also called as initialization method. When we create an instance object of the class, initialization method will be called. In order to enter initialization method, we need to use def keyword. Next, we should enter double underscore init double underscore. Next, we put opening and closing parentheses. And we put colon operator. Now, between the parentheses of initialization method, the required parameters will be entered. We first enter self parameter. Please note that self will be reference to the instance of this class. Whenever you enter the initialization method of the class, your first parameter will be self. All the parameters will be comma separated. Next, we enter the parameters which are needed for this class. Let's say make, model, and year are needed in this class. Within the initialization method, we have to enter self dot parameter is equal to parameter. It will be like that. Self dot make is equal to make. Self dot model is equal to model. Self dot year is equal to year. By these assignments, the new object will be instantiated with these parameters. And in the next lecture, we will see that when we create an object from this class, these parameters will be entered between the parentheses. And let me enter print function here. It will be displaying a message on the screen when an instance of the class is created. So the message is that instance object of the class is created. Let's define another method within this class here. And let's say this method will display the make, model, and year of the object. To define this method, we will be using def keyword again. Let's name this method as display parameters. Again, opening and closing parentheses and colon operator. Between the parentheses, we have to enter self. In the following indented line, we enter the code set which will be executed when this method is called. Using print function, first display the make. Please note that when we display it, we are calling the member by self dot make. Next, let's display the model. In the next line, let's display the year. I made a mistake here. Let's display this string part, model and year. Please note how we access the members within the class. We said self.make, self.model, self.year. And also, in order to leave one empty line, let's enter empty print function. Yes, that's it. Actually, this is enough to create a class. We have to first enter class keyword, and then we have to enter the name of the class. Next, we put the colon operator. After that, optionally, we enter the documentation for the class. If you don't need any explanation, you can remove this part. Next, we defined initialization method for this class. In order to do that, we first entered def keyword. Next, we entered double underscore init, double underscore, and it is followed by opening and closing parentheses and colon operator. Between the parentheses, we enter the parameters, and the first parameter should be self. In the next line, we made these assignments. Please note self.parameter is equal to parameter, self dot another parameter is equal to that parameter, self.year is equal to year. I entered this line optionally in order to show something in the next lecture, so you can enter this part as well. After the initialization method, I defined another method in order to give some example. And please note how we access the members here. By self dot. So the creation of the class is done. This is the end of the lecture. In the next lecture, we will create an instance object for this class.